it was news to officials at CRA that they would be responsible for auditing the labor provisions as part of the investment tax credits. I'm just wondering, has your office looked at the number of people that might be required to perform the auditing required? It was news to CRA officials that they would be responsible for this new auditing requirement.
It's not something we have looked at, the number of individuals or employees necessary for CRA to administer specific tax measures. But I have to say I'm a bit surprised to hear that CRA officials did not know that, because in my experience there is usually quite a bit of back and forth between the Department of Finance and CRA on the administration of tax measures that are proposed for inclusion in the budget to ensure that in fact CRA can indeed administer measures that are considered for inclusion in budgets or estimates.
Thank you. I read some Senate committee testimony, which led me to believe that there was a little bit of surprise there. Just sticking on people, because your office does some great work on looking at departmental spending plans and the people plan for government. My recollection is every year for at least the last 4 or 5 years, each departmental spending plan will show that in the next year, the total number of FTEs, full-time equivalents, will drop. Except when that year finishes, it turns out that that's not realized, and actually the number goes up. In the budget that was just presented 2 days ago, the government is assuming that, or it's banking on, because it's capturing the savings from a reduction in full-time equivalents. Have you seen, in your number of years, have you actually seen a reduction in full-time equivalents in the last 5 or 6 years from one year to the next?
No, I don't recall seeing a reduction in the overall number of full-time equivalents or employees in the federal public service as a whole. There might have been decreases in some specific areas or some specific agencies or departments, but as a whole, the public service has increased consistently year after year.
As parliamentarians, should we be concerned that a government or departments plan to have a smaller workforce at the end of the year, but then never actually achieve it? Like, what's the issue with the planning and the execution?
I think the planning is not reflecting subsequent measures that are introduced by governments. For example, the departmental plans that are usually prepared early in the fiscal year or in advance of the budget don't include measures that are in the budget. So there's a time lag between the preparation of the plans and the implementation of these plans. For example, in the budget, there is substantial resources for some departments and agencies, notably CRA, to improve response time for call centers, notably, just to take one example. This will presumably require FTEs. So the CRA departmental plan or agency plan probably did not reflect that. So they may table plans that suggest a decrease in the number of FTEs, but what ends up happening once they are made aware of the budget and the implication for each department and agency, then it gets reflected in reality, and that very often leads to a revision upwards to the number of employees.
Right. So most pieces of every piece of legislation that comes here, a question is always asked, well, how many people does it require to execute on the legislation or the plan? And the answer is, well, we don't really have that number. You'll have to ask Treasury Board. And then you go ask Treasury Board, and they say, oh, well, we're not really sure. But presumably, like, somebody knows somewhere, or is there actually nobody looking at a people plan for the government?
Every single piece of policy proposal, be it legislation or program, there has to be a memorandum to cabinet, which normally would include the number of employees required to implement that legislative piece or that program, or at the very least in the Treasury Board submission. So it's an integral part of the budget submission and the budget request to have the number of FTEs required to implement a plan.
And last, just final question. I have heard that there may be some significant amendments coming to C-59. Do you think that those amendments, if they're substantial, would be better put forth to committee with some time to review them as opposed to at report stage?
That's a question related to parliamentary procedure, and I don't think I'm the best person to answer that. It depends on the nature of these amendments. But if they're substantial, I would think so.
Thank you in your office for all your work.
Okay.
Last question, Mr. Giroux. We've talked about this before. The non-announced measures in the budget. The government released $1.8 billion in this fiscal year in the non-announced measures. I get the need for secrecy and non-disclosure, but why, as a parliamentarian, do I not know how much money is sitting in each fiscal year in that line? I don't know if next year they have $20 billion in that line that they could all of a sudden release, or $2 billion, or maybe $1. All we see as a parliamentarian is the change in that account from update to update. Is that something that you might be able to help us with?
It's something that is of concern to me because there are, as you pointed out, there can be very valid reasons to disclose an amount without with an aggregate amount without itemizing it, but not disclosing its changes and items that are financed from this line makes it much more difficult to follow the money, so to speak. So it's of concern.